there is a problem with sovereignty. And it's more of a definitional problem than anything else, I think, in that what has happened is that in many cases, people have taken sovereignty to mean control instead of authority. Namely that when God is sovereign, that means that God has control. God is controlling, and all things are subject to God's control. And what's unfortunate is that a lot of the conversations which call that into question are not doing so from the perspective of saying God can't do that, but a matter of whether God would choose to do that. There's this weird paradox that I have tried to get people to answer for me for a number of years, and it goes like this. Is God sovereign over his sovereignty? Is God sovereign over his sovereignty? So is sovereignty a trait that defines God, or is sovereignty an aspect of God, and God can choose when to manifest it and when not to? That's a terrible sentence, but forgive me. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll use an analogy with respect to the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Was Jesus Christ hungry because he chose to be hungry? Was that his sovereign decree that on such and such a date I'm going to be hungry? Or was there a system in place that his physical body operated under? And if you do not eat food for a period of time, you get hungry. And so Jesus Christ is not hungry as a direct consequence of the will, but an indirect consequence, because there was a system in place which had causes and effects, and he chose to be in submission to that system. The reason you got a stoplight in front of you is because I want to try and use this as a different kind of example, because sometimes, an example like Christ's incarnation, that can be really difficult to manage. That's an analogy, as a parallel. There are a lot of strong disagreements about who Christ is, not just in a literal sense, but in a metaphysical and a spiritual sense. There are a lot of questions that people have about the identity, the relationship to concepts like the Trinity and whatnot. So to move away from that and to not let that become a new distraction, I want to posit the stoplight as our new method of trying to understand the dynamics at play. For most of you, you've seen a stoplight before in real life. You understand how they work. The basic premise is that there's a light that controls the traffic. And when stoplights are working correctly, traffic will flow better than it would if people were just making their own choice. It's a system of control over individuals' behavior. But here's the thing. You'll see on one side of the screen, I've circled, and it might be hard to see because I tried to find a picture of a stoplight that had the control box in it. And this was as good as I could do in about 5 minutes of effort. So I certainly could have found something better if I worked harder, but there's a control box over there which actually dictates how the stoplight functions. And inside of that is computers, basically. I'm going to reduce it really down to very simplistic terms. It's a computer, and the computer tells the stoplight what to do, which light should be on, and so on and so forth. Likewise, there are often sensors in the ground which feed information to that computer. And when there's not, the computer has to work off of different inputs in order to determine when the lights need to change. Perhaps you've encountered before timed stoplights. stoplights that don't actually respond to traffic, but are basically just a timer. After so much time, the light will change, and it doesn't matter how many cars are backed up. It's going to remain what it's going to remain. The pattern will play out. But the stoplights, which have a sensor in the ground, though they will account for the presence of traffic in changing the stoplight. There's a town, Oregon City, north of where I spent most of my childhood, and they even have a sign up, which I forget the specific speed, but I think it was like 20 or 25, something like that. Anyway, the sign basically indicates that the stoplights are not only is there a sensor in the ground, but it's all been queued up. The system has been so finely tuned that if you're driving a particular speed and there's no cross traffic, you'll get green lights the whole way through the town. And there's a lot of stoplights here. It's not like there's just one or two. There's like a half dozen. And so, if you're driving the speed limit that is indicated on the sign, that hey, you're going to get green lights the whole way through. You don't even have to. It's almost as if the stoplight isn't even there. Now, the reason why I bring all this stuff up is because this is a system, and this system was designed by someone. And whether that system works or not, how it functions, all that kind of stuff, is contingent on that designer. The programming of the computer, the integration of the sensors that provide that computer information, all of that stuff is part of a system that was designed, that was put in place. It didn't just naturally occur. It didn't just pop up out of nothing. And the problem, and how this kind of ties back to sovereignty, is that people treat salvation as if in every single one of these control boxes, for every single stoplight that has ever existed or ever will exist, the engineer who designed the stoplight is actually in there flipping all the switches himself. The assertion with respect to sovereignty being control means that in every manifestation of the stoplights, every control box, they're not actually independent of each other. They're not actually capable of regulating themselves or operating independently of that which created them. And this isn't to say that the engineer can't come in and change the switches or reprogram the computer, but that even the day-to-day function from moment to moment, nothing happens without that engineer directly controlling that specific light. Now, take that up to the God level, and people will say, "Oh, well, obviously as an individual, I couldn't manage, millions or billions of lights, across the whole country, let alone the whole world, all that kind of thing. So obviously it's going to be difficult for me, but for God, that's easy. God could totally be in every little box controlling every single traffic light." But is that what the Bible tells us? Is that really what the Bible tells us? You see, the problem is, in the name of glorifying God, people have tried to take God's choices away. And then they say that their critics are somehow man-centered, as if that's the main issue. That people said, well, what does man need to be? And then reshape God around that. While the people that they're fighting against are, we're upholding what God has said. We're glorifying God through our assertions, through our beliefs, through our systematic theology. You see, salvation is a system. It was designed by God. And here's the thing about systems. The greater the degree of autonomy from the designer of that system, the more capable the designer has to be in order for it to continue to function. So these stoplights, the ones that are on a timer, really simple computer. It doesn't take as much brain power to set that kind of a system up. You get some relays to timers, and as long as a bulb isn't out, there's not a whole lot to it. But you start putting sensors in the ground. You make the light responsive to the reality of what cars are present and waiting. That takes more effort, because now you're not just saying, well, is a car present? Go change the light. It's, well, a car is present, but what's the current state of the light? How long has the light been in its current state? Because here's the thing, like sometimes there will be stoplights. Say the stoplight closest to us. It's on a main street. Like it's a 4-lane, technically 5, I guess, street that's it's kind of like an old highway. Not quite interstate level, but it moves a lot of cars. And we've got a 2-lane residential road that comes off of it. But we've got a stoplight because of just how big that intersection is, and people who want to get out of the neighborhoods need a control mechanism to stop the cross traffic and let us out, so we can go out our day and do our things. You would want to give a bias towards the bigger road and say, hey, just because one car showed up that wants to cross or turn left or whatnot, you don't stop the 100 or so cars that are now coming down the road. You might say, all right, let's give it some time, and then after a point of time has passed, then we'll let the cross traffic have their ability to drive. It's a system, and it's more complicated than just, well, have it red for 5 minutes and then turn it to green, and have it the other, flip them every 5 minutes or every 2 minutes or whatever. To have that greater complexity requires a more intelligent designer. And so what has happened is that we have a very vocal, a very influential branch of Christian doctrine that has tried to flip this on its head, to assert that if God isn't in control of everything, somehow that is a denigration of God. That if God isn't in every one of those little control boxes, that somehow we are glorifying man. Instead of understanding that we live in a series of systems. The water cycle is a system. Bodily decomposition is a system. Digestion is a system. We have all these different systems that we believe God has created, and yet, at the same time, people want to assert that God could not have created them independent, that every one of them fundamentally, not just indirectly, relies on God having created them, created the mechanisms, the laws of physics that would guide their continued operation, but that literally nothing happens apart from God doing it actively. No sodium and chlorine molecules or atoms combine to form salt unless God wants it to happen. At no point can God choose to create a system where the interaction of electrons and protons and neutrons and all that jazz creates a system of chemical interactions where these two elements combining produce a third, which is not either of the two things you started with. That God can't create systems of independence because somehow that denigrates the sovereignty of God. But again, that presumes sovereignty is control. If sovereignty is authority, it's a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different focus and emphasis. Because no longer is God required to intervene in the occurrence of anything that ever actually occurs. God has authority over it, but that doesn't mean he has causal relationship. That doesn't mean God is making the sodium and the chlorine combine to form salt. That God created a system which was genuinely independent of God's constant action Not because God needed to save himself the time, or he couldn't create a system that relied on him, but because we don't need to assert that that's exactly what God did, and in so doing take choice away from God. So often the more deterministic brothers and sisters of the faith, they criticize that we try to give man a choice, but what they don't realize, again, is that they're taking choices away from God, not from man. God cannot choose to create something that is genuinely independent of God. God cannot choose to submit to a system that even he has created. That the engineer of the stoplight, obviously, because he created it, he can't be regulated by it. He can't choose to abide by it. He's free. He created it. He's above it. He has control over it. So it shouldn't certainly have anything to say about him. I mean, that's the kind of illogical circumstance that we find ourselves having to deal with. The stoplights function independent of their creator. The person who designed them is not literally in control of every aspect of what a stoplight does in every manifestation of a stoplight. But if the stoplight is broken, who better to go to in order to get it fixed? If there's a belief that the stoplight doesn't function correctly, if it's not sufficiently efficient, who are you going to go to? Well, you go to the designer. You go to the person who put the system together. Think about that. Think about what sovereignty means to you. What is it that you understand the word sovereignty to mean? And with respect to this analogy, the stoplight, obviously analogies are not the best way to do with things. It would be so much easier but it serves as an objective point of reference. And so until we've beat this analogy till it's no longer useful, where do you see that assignment of responsibility? Do you see God in the control box flipping the switches? Do you see the potential? And here's the thing, not even that God did it this way, but the potential for God to have made a choice. Because even that is something that some folks will not allow. God cannot have made a choice. Things have to be a particular way, and God is in control of all of it. And that's where their hope rests. Not in what God has done and what God is continuing to do in their lives, but that nothing they do will change what is inevitable. Nothing that they do can either save or damn them, because it is entirely of God. They have nothing to do with the process. Play with it, find problems with it, criticize it, but think about it. Think about what sovereignty means to you. Think about what Scripture says about sovereignty. And if control doesn't seem to fit, and authority is a more appropriate connotation, how does that impact the way we look at salvation? How does that impact the way we look at sanctification? How does that impact the way we look at sin? I'm curious to know what others find, what others are thinking about. Until then, though, take care.